In this video, we uncover how rising global powers are quietly building a parallel financial system to reduce reliance on the dollar, using new banks, payment networks, and strategic alliances. It's a silent but historic shift that could reshape who really controls global money.
What if the global financial system you trust isn't as permanent as it looks? Quietly, a coalition of rising powers is designing an alternative to the dollar-dominated order. Not through speeches, but through banks, payment rails, and trade deals that bypass the West entirely. This isn't a headline crisis. It's a slow structural shift involving strategy, influence, and trillions of dollars. And while most people aren't watching, the architecture of global finance may already be changing. Stay with me, because what's unfolding could redefine who really controls money in the 21st century. The silent financial shift. The alliance known as BRICS began as an economic acronym, not a revolution. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa were grouped together because analysts saw growth potential. But over time, their meetings shifted tone. Instead of just trade cooperation, discussions turned towards something deeper: dependence. For decades, global finance has revolved around Western institutions and the US dollar. Trade is priced in dollars. Reserves are stored in dollars, and international settlements often pass through Western-controlled infrastructure. That system works smoothly until geopolitics intervenes. Sanctions, restrictions, and financial freezes showed many countries that access to the global economy can be switched off. Why it matters. Once nations realize financial access can be weaponized, they start building alternatives. What they're not telling you. This isn't a rebellion. It's risk management. These countries aren't trying to overthrow the system overnight. They're quietly ensuring they don't depend.
So, is this an anti-Western alliance?
Not exactly. It's more accurate to call it a hedge against Western leverage. The dollar's hidden power. The global influence of the US dollar isn't just about currency. It's about control. When transactions clear through Western banking channels, they fall under Western jurisdiction. That gives policymakers indirect authority over global commerce. Historically, nations accepted this because stability mattered more than autonomy. The system built after World War II, supported by institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, created predictable rules. For decades, that predictability fueled growth. But stability has a price: dependency. Countries holding large dollar reserves are exposed to policy decisions made in Washington. Interest rate shifts, sanctions, or banking regulations can ripple worldwide overnight. Why it matters. Monetary dominance translates into geopolitical leverage. What they're not telling you. Most governments don't openly criticize dollar dominance because their own economies still rely on it. Publicly challenging the system could destabilize markets they depend on.
If everyone depends on it, why change anything?
Because dependence feels safe until it suddenly doesn't. Sanctions as a wake-up call. Financial sanctions changed the strategic calculus. When major economies saw how quickly reserves could be frozen or payment channels blocked, it triggered a realization. Access to money can be restricted without a single soldier deployed. For policymakers in emerging powers, this wasn't theoretical. It was a preview of vulnerability. The message was clear: if geopolitical tensions rise, financial isolation becomes a real risk. Why it matters. Sanctions demonstrated that financial infrastructure is part of modern warfare strategy. What they're not telling you. Even countries that support sanctions quietly analyze how to protect themselves from ever being targeted. This is where long-term planning began. Instead of reacting publicly, BRICS states started investing in alternative payment systems, local currency trade agreements, and reserve diversification. None of these moves make headlines daily, but together they form a pattern.
Are these measures defensive or offensive?
Mostly defensive, but defensive systems can become powerful tools if widely adopted. Building new financial rails. One of the least discussed developments is the creation of parallel transaction networks. The global system most banks use is SWIFT. It doesn't hold money, it sends payment instructions. But access to it determines whether banks can transact internationally. Some BRICS members have developed alternatives. China built its own cross-border payment system. Russia launched a domestic messaging network. Individually, these systems are limited, but if interconnected, they could form a non-Western payment web. Why it matters? Financial infrastructure determines who could trade with whom. What they're not telling you. These systems don't need to replace SWIFT globally to matter. They only need enough adoption to give participating countries options. Options reduce vulnerability, and reduced vulnerability shifts negotiating power.
Could these networks actually rival SWIFT?
Not soon globally, but regionally they already can. The bank that signals intent. In 2014, BRICS nations created the New Development Bank. Officially, it funds infrastructure and sustainable development. Unofficially, it sends a message. Emerging economies can finance each other without relying on Western-dominated lenders. The bank structure is symbolic. Voting power is distributed more evenly than in traditional institutions, where influence often reflects historical wealth rather than current growth. Why it matters? Financial institutions shape global priorities. Whoever funds projects influences which projects exist. What they're not telling you. The bank's loan volume is still small compared to established institutions, but its political significance outweighs its balance sheet. It proves an alternative framework can exist. And symbolism in geopolitics is never just symbolism. It signals intent, tests cooperation, and builds trust among participants.
So, is the bank economically powerful yet?
Not in size, but in strategic meaning, absolutely. Trading without dollars. Several BRICS countries have begun settling trade in their own currencies. Oil deals denominated in yuan, rupee ruble transactions, and bilateral swap agreements all point to a gradual shift. This isn't about eliminating the dollar entirely. It's about reducing how often it's needed. Each trade settled in local currency is one less transaction passing through Western financial channels. Why it matters? Currency choice determines whose monetary policy influences global trade. What they're not telling you, local currency trade carries risks. Exchange rate volatility can complicate pricing and contracts, but governments accept those risks for strategic autonomy. It's similar to diversifying investments. You don't abandon your strongest asset. You just avoid putting everything in it.
Will the dollar lose dominance soon?
Unlikely in the near term, but dominance can erode gradually without dramatic headlines. Expansion changes the equation. Interest in joining BRICS has grown among countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Expansion discussions signal that the bloc could become less of a club and more of a platform. Why it matters? The larger the network, the more viable alternative systems become. Financial ecosystems depend on participation. A payment system used by 5 countries is limited. One used by 20 is influential. What they're not telling you, not all applicants share the same motivations. Some want investment, others want political alignment. Some simply want leverage in negotiations with Western partners. Expansion isn't just about numbers. It's about diversity of resources, oil producers, manufacturing hubs, and commodity exporters. Together, that mix could sustain internal trade independent of traditional financial routes.
Does expansion mean unity?
Not necessarily. Growth increases influence, but it also increases internal disagreements. Competing visions inside the alliance. BRICS is not a monolith. Each member has distinct priorities. China focuses on long-term financial architecture. India emphasizes strategic independence. Russia prioritizes sanction resilience. Brazil and South Africa often stress development financing. Why it matters? Internal differences shape how fast any alternative system can evolve. What they're not telling you, disagreements can actually strengthen the project. When multiple powers negotiate rules, the result is often more balanced and therefore more attractive to outsiders. Still, competing visions slow decision-making. Unlike centralized alliances, BRICS operates through consensus. That makes it cautious but durable. Think of it less like a military alliance and more like a coalition of investors pooling resources for mutual protection.
Could internal rivalry collapse the project?
Rivalry may delay progress, but shared incentives make total collapse unlikely. The long game strategy. The most important aspect of this shift is time horizon. Western financial dominance developed over generations. BRICS planners understand that replacing or balancing it will also take decades. Why it matters. Slow strategies are harder to detect and harder to counter. What they're not telling you. Many of these initiatives are intentionally incremental. Small agreements, pilot programs, and regional tests rarely attract global attention. But layered together, they form structural change. This is classic geopolitical strategy. Build parallel systems quietly until they're too integrated to ignore. By the time the world notices, the architecture already exists. That's why analysts who focus only on daily headlines often miss the trend. Structural shifts don't announce themselves. They accumulate.
So the real story isn't any single event?
Exactly. The real story is the pattern formed by many small events. What the future might look like. The likely outcome isn't a world where one system replaces another. It's a multipolar financial order. Some countries will operate mainly in the traditional system. Others will use BRICS-linked channels. Many will use both. Why it matters. When multiple systems coexist, no single power controls global finance. That redistributes influence, not instantly but steadily. What they're not telling you. This transition could increase complexity. Businesses may need to navigate parallel regulations, currencies, and settlement networks. But complexity often accompanies shifts in power balance. The emerging reality isn't collapse. It's diversification. And diversification changes who sets the rules.
So should ordinary people care about this?
Yes, because global financial architecture ultimately shapes inflation, trade prices, job markets, and economic stability everywhere.
Thanks for breaking all of that down and giving us such a clear look behind the scenes. That was incredibly insightful.
My pleasure. It's a complex story, but understanding these shifts helps us see where the world might be heading next.